Good morning, Hendersonville. Welcome to the Auditorium class for February 23rd. As you can see, Dr. Cloud and I are coming to you once again in video format. And this time it's my fault. Cheryl's birthday is actually today. And we are traveling back from Fall Creek Falls with her sister and my brother-in-law and her. That's what she wanted for her birthday. So we're thankful for this technology and still being able to be together. And Dr. Cloud and I have had a real enjoyable time putting this lesson together. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. Dr. Cloud, I hope you are as well.
I am, and we want to welcome, say shalom, in the hello situation type thing to our scholars in the audience. We're really glad to have you here, and we're glad to be with you.
Absolutely. So we're going to jump on over here to the slides and get right back into the Gospels that we've been covering, and we're still in Mark. And this morning, like we have had happen a couple of times, this morning it's going to happen multiple times where we're actually looking at scenes that are in other Gospel accounts, and we're going to be bringing some of those details together, like we had kind of told you would happen. As we move through this study, just jumping into Mark and kind of where we left off, we promised you we would start with the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth. And this is covered in Mark chapter 6 and also Luke chapter 4. And Dr. Cloud, I think most people are familiar with this story, but I was very interested in how Mark is sort of building upon information that he's already shared with us to this point in his gospel account. It starts out there in chapter 6 with the Sabbath came, and he's already talked about the Sabbath back in chapter 1 and verse 21. And then he talks about Jesus beginning to teach in the synagogue, which the last time he told us about Jesus teaching in the synagogue, he was exorcising demons back in chapter 1, verse 23, which we went through a couple of weeks ago. He mentions that many who heard Jesus were amazed. And I thought this was interesting. Amazement and astonishment at Jesus' teaching is all through Mark. If you look there in the parenthetical references, chapter 1, verse 22, chapter 10, 24 through 26, chapter 11, 18, and chapter 12, verse 17, all mentions this awe and amazement of Jesus' teaching. And then miracles are in chapter 1, 27, 2, 12, 5, 20, 5, 42, 6, 50 through 51, and chapter 7, verse 37. And so these are repeated themes in Mark's gospel account that people are amazed and astonished to listen to Jesus' teaching with authority, and he's following his teaching up with physical manifestations of his abilities as the Son of God. One commentator said, while the Psalms regularly intone the theme of awe of God, this may not be exactly what's happening here in Mark 6, because we would say, well, then why would Jesus be rejected if that was what was happening? And so notice what's in yellow. Those in Mark responded in awe, but the awe they responded in, by many scholars, seems to be more like the way the ancestors responded in awe to impressive achievements of past leaders like Saul and David and Solomon. So maybe they're already leaning towards this idea of responding in awe, not because they've identified Jesus as God, as Yahweh in the flesh, but as somebody who's going to empower them as the people that they thought they were rightfully expecting from what they know from the Old Testament. Does that sound like that's a possibility?
Yeah, sure. Jesus is is going to be obviously someone like they have never been around, and he's going to do things and say things that are going to stop and make you think. And his his actions, his activity, oftentimes are going to not scare the people, but it's going to make them want to know what's going to happen next. And remember, we're looking at this heavily through Peter's eyes, and you can just almost imagine, Peter as he's walking around with Jesus and listening to this also, and the disciples themselves sometimes are puzzled, but Jesus is continually full of surprises.
Agreed. So let's talk about Jesus being rejected. The scene there is that he's in the synagogue. There's a whole bunch of discussion about that from archaeology. Not too long ago, I was reading an article and someone said there wasn't even a synagogue at Nazareth. We can't find any remains of one. And then somebody else said, well, you got to remember Nazareth was a smallish place. Their synagogue could have been open air. It could have been outside in nature. It doesn't have to be a building that has to be found like in some of the bigger cities, which I thought was a very interesting point. Doesn't mean that because archaeology hasn't found the foundation of a building that we can just throw all this out and say, well, this might not have happened because we can't find the remains of the building. But the artist here has drawn it as a building with columns and being a big structure, and maybe not. But the point is, we both believe that even if there's not archaeological evidence for something, that there was a synagogue of some kind. And Jesus goes to that synagogue, and the custom was for someone to read from the scroll. And if I'm understanding it correctly, they use the little pointer that they follow the Hebrew with, and they just find a place sort of guided by the Spirit of where to start reading. It just so happens Jesus unrolls the scroll of Isaiah and starts reading from chapter 61. And in 61, what he reads, this is just the first 3 verses. It says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord," of course, every time we see Lord in all caps, that's Yahweh. That's Yahweh, God's personal name. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord Yahweh God is upon me, because Yahweh has chosen me. He has commissioned me to encourage the poor, to help the brokenhearted, to decree the release of captives and the freeing of prisoners, to announce the year when the Lord will show his favor and the day when our God will seek vengeance, to console all who mourn, to strengthen those who mourn in Zion by giving them a turban instead of ashes, oil symbolizing joy instead of mourning, a garment symbolizing praise instead of discouragement. They will be called oaks of righteousness, trees planted by the Lord to reveal his splendor." So it makes me wonder. I think I can see why Mark's account having maybe the awe not being so much of God. This could be interpreted that this is God's man who has been anointed to do the overthrowing of Rome and to put the Jews in the position that they think they've been waiting to be restored to. And that may be what is setting the mood here. And then there's also another possibility that I think is simultaneously going on, and that is some people are very angry that Jesus is reading this and applying it to himself. All those instances of, I am the one that's doing this, and I have been anointed to do this, and I'm releasing the captives, and I'm bringing this. They think it's blasphemous because that's something that God does. And that kind of sets the scene, I think, for the emotions that come as these men get very upset. So what are your thoughts on all that?
Well, let me go back to the archaeological evidence. We haven't found a synagogue at Nazareth because there's been very little excavation going on in Nazareth. Nazareth, what they've done is just really a very small area, and they built a village there. But we know there was 2 synagogues at Magdala, a synagogue at Chorazin, a synagogue at Capernaum. So just every once in a while, another synagogue pops up. There were a lot of synagogues around, and it doesn't mean there wasn't one there. But to the point you made a while ago, very good point. It was probably, if there was a building, it was a very simple building, very simple structure. This is a very poor village, and so I think that someday they may find one. But if they don't, again, the artist got a little carried away probably of making that a very fancy synagogue. Secondly, I think that a word Evid that starts out as slave and then later becomes a staff member of the king, then is used of the prophets, my servants, the prophets, and then it has a special meaning in Isaiah. And the suffering servant is called Evid. The exact same word is used. And here you are in the same book, and heavily in 52 and 53, it talks about the suffering servant. The suffering servant was interpreted by many to be Israel, And it turns out to be it's not Israel, it's Jesus. And he's dealing with some topics that they've heard people comment on, and it's coming out differently with Jesus. And this would either make you excited or make you angry. And you can see the anger on the screen.
Absolutely. And I think it's a combination of two different things. It's the combination of that anger that you mentioned for them interpreting him saying he's the suffering servant, as you said, and it also might be the awe on the other side that they are mishearing what he's claiming is happening. Those mighty oaks of righteousness, and all of that, and the vengeance of God, all that makes it sound like, all right, finally we're gonna be back to the top of the heap, and we're gonna be the people that everybody else has to answer to, because really coming out of captivity till now, they haven't really had any status, right? Jews lost their status during captivity, and when they came out, when Judah and Benjamin came out of captivity, they never really went back to a position of power before with the Davidic kingdom. They reject Jesus, and it's interesting how this is played out in different depictions of this. Here's a picture where it looks like clearly they're still inside whatever the synagogue is, and the Chosen does the same thing. The Chosen has them get so upset at Jesus when he reads that from Isaiah 61 that they tell him that he needs to retract it. And they get in his face like this picture, and they give him an opportunity to retract it. And when he doesn't, then they threaten him that they're going to take him outside. And so that takes us to a statement that Jesus makes here in Mark 6, verse 4, where Jesus says to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own house. And so I was proposing, Dr. Cloud, that that's probably a comparison to Jeremiah, who was also considered a prophet without honor, and his hometown rejected him.
Right. Yeah, it happened time and time again with the prophets. And so Jesus applies that to himself, and Jeremiah would be an excellent example.
Another interesting thing here, and that is that why would he say a prophet is without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives? The scuttlebutt that's going on here in the surrounding scene is that they're all whispering, isn't this Joseph the carpenter's son? I mean, don't we know his mom? Don't we know who he is? But he's from our own town. This can't be, he can't be who he's claiming to be. And so I think that's also part of what's wrapped up in him making this statement.
Right.
Unlike Mark, we have to go over to another account for the attempted cliff throwing off. Mark doesn't mention it, which is interesting because we discussed before we started recording this, there's not another scene in Nazareth. This has to be the same one where they go to throw him off the cliff, but Mark just doesn't mention it for some reason. But the angry mob gets angrier, and they decide that this blasphemous talk, since he won't retract it, like I said, the Chosen is inserting that into the narrative, but since he won't retract it, then it's blasphemy, and blasphemy is punishable by death. And so they're going to throw him off the cliff. And this was an interesting question. Did Jesus fail at Nazareth?
No, he didn't. And first of all, let me say a word before I answer that. It was not until 1992 that I understood this so much better. I always thought Nazareth was just down on the plain. I didn't know Nazareth was on top of a hill, a really high hill. And it was a shock for me to see that. But in any case, and of course, we have another gospel account that's telling you that Jesus disappeared in their midst. They were going to throw him off the cliff and going to kill him. But again, I have to go back and remember that here in Mark's account, this is really, we believe, Peter's account. And Peter must have talked about it and lectured on this kind of stuff. And what Peter would have been doing was picking out some points that are very crucial. Uh, Peter probably remembers those days. You can look back in your own life and think of things happening, and where am I going to go from here? What's happening here? And now Peter sees it in a totally different light. Um, he sees Jesus identifying himself with the suffering servant. He sees the people getting upset. He sees the people wanting to hear more or wanting to kill him. And so Peter knows Peter knows what's going to happen in the future. Peter knows that we're going to be convinced ourselves. We're going to be excited ourselves. We're going to find out ourselves. We're going to doubt him ourselves. So we're having all these thoughts running through our mind, but Jesus is planting a lot of seeds right here.
I really like that explanation. I was thinking while you were talking, we were talking just last week or the week before about how Jesus' own brothers didn't believe in him until after the resurrection. Jude, James, the text just tells us they did not believe at that time. And so I think what's happening here is a juxtaposition of people who grew up with Jesus in Nazareth, who knew him as the human being little boy that was running around behind Joseph and Mary and whatever, and now they're hearing him claim things that they don't seem to be able to reconcile with who they think that he is. And that may be some of the very similar things that James and Jude were doing, because he was their half brother. They don't understand it either. So I would say that Jesus didn't fail at Nazareth for two reasons. One, I love the way the chosen, one of the texts in the gospel account says that he just moves right through the crowd and just walks right through them. And you kind of wonder, well, how did that happen? They were going to go throw him off the cliff, and then all of a sudden they're just kind of like, who's watching him? Oh, nobody. He got away. No, it's more in the chosen. He actually says to them as he walks through there, this isn't happening today. Now, that's not a quote from scripture, but I love what they did, because it took me back to the devil tempting him, saying, why don't you throw yourself down and the angels will save you? Well, he didn't fail because, he doesn't get thrown down, so the angels don't have to save him. Number two, he has power over the situation. Number three, maybe the most important point, is that like his brothers, these people after his resurrection from his hometown will also come to faith and believe if they understand at that time who he is, which is what you just basically implied with your comments too. So, yeah, we don't think that Jesus failed at Nazareth. We think he was loving, and the text even tells us that he often looked on these people as just sheep without a shepherd. They don't know any better, and so he let them be and let them kind of organically learn about him like his brothers and his sisters did. And going along on that theme a little bit more, wisdom is deemed especially important for rulers. Back to kind of what maybe people were thinking. Solomon asked God, give me wisdom and knowledge that I may lead this people. For who's able to govern this great people of yours? And you can find that in 2 Chronicles and also in Ezra. So that made me think of John 6:15. Just as we're thinking about now, we're kind of holistically thinking about the gospel, the good news from the view of all the gospel accounts, right? If we think about what John tells us later, Jesus has this group of people that were going to try to seize him and by force make him king, and he had to withdraw himself from them. And so I wonder if there's not a little bit of echo here of these people were upset because of the blasphemy type interpretation, and they were taking swift, rash action. And then later, when people interpreted that, hey, this is our guy who's gonna overthrow the Romans and put us in power, they also took rash action and tried to make him king. And so on this occurrence, they went with the blasphemy interpretation. Later, they go with the powerful ruler or earthly king interpretation. Well, so we move to the death of John the Baptist. Now, this is interesting. We don't have to read this word for word, but if you look here on the screen or if you following along in your Bible, Mark chapter 6, 21 through 25 tells us about the scene we're familiar with about John the Baptist being beheaded, where Herodias' daughter dances for Herod, and then he's so pleased with her dance, he offers her up to half the kingdom, whatever she wants. She runs to her mother and says, "What do I need to ask for?" She says, "Ask for John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist's head." And immediately she hurries back. This immediately word, you notice, is still showing up from Mark. Immediately, she hurries back to the king and makes her request. "I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter immediately." And it tells us that it grieved Herod. He didn't want to execute John the Baptist, but he also had all of his guests that he'd made this public oath to Herodias' daughter. And so he sends and has John executed and has the head brought. And then the disciples hear about this and they come and take John's body and place it in a tomb. The Chosen works with this too. The death of John the Baptist, a character that we came to love in all of the different episodes, and this is also covered in Matthew 14 as well as Mark chapter 6.
Yeah, there are several things I'd like to say about this. That first of all, this is a flashback. John, when we're in the approaching the story, John has already been killed.
Yeah, right here on this slide. Yeah.
Right. So this is a flashback. And when Herod hears about it, he makes the statement, he said, John the baptizer has been raised from the dead right here. Well, actually, the Greek says Herod kept on saying, he repeated over and over again. He just wouldn't say it one time, but he was obsessed with this. Now, Herod Antipas was one of the sons of Herod the Great. He's the one that inherited as a tetrarch. He wanted more, but he got the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Perea is on the Jordanian side. It runs down past the Dead Sea on the eastern side. Coming into play in this story is going to be Herodias. And Herodias is actually the granddaughter of Herod the Great. And she is has a brother who is Agrippa the First. She first marries a guy, one of the sons of Herod, who did not get any land. That was named Philip. She divorced him. There's a Herod Philip. There's a Herod Philip the Tetrarch. So these are the ones in the north there. But in any case, she divorced him, married Herod Antipas. And this scene takes place at a place called Macarius, which is in Perea, east of the Dead Sea. It's a mountain fortress there. The word Macarius is a Greek name meaning the sword. And it was at this spot, Josephus tells us, it's where they were meeting. Herod had a capital at Sepphoris, moved the capital to Tiberias, and this was his main capital, but he had a fortress and a retreat down at Macarius on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. And this is where Salome dances. Salome is not mentioned in the Bible by name, but Josephus tells us this is the daughter. She's also, believe it or not, a family member. And she dances, and of course, you know the rest of the story. The text, King James says that Herod observed John. The Greek word really means, and that probably meant the right thing in 1611, the Greek word means he protected. He actually protected John. He didn't want anything to happen to John. He wasn't happy what John was saying, but he didn't want anything to happen to him. And he got tricked into cutting his head off.
Yeah, and I was thinking while you were talking about Macarius, we wouldn't need anything else than what you said. But what was also fascinating to me is that they were able to corroborate all of that information from Josephus and others through the tile work that matched at Macarius to Herod's other buildings and his other palace. And they said that he had a particular tile style and color that kind of signified his structures, and Macarius had it. and so they think that that is a another level of confirmation that all of that information is accurate. So the chosen did something interesting. As John was bent over the executioner's bench for the big blade to come down, which luckily they didn't show us that part. Also, I remember as a kid. I don't. You probably remember. You can probably tell me what it was. But as a child, I remember seeing a scene where John the Baptist's head was placed on a silver platter and brought out, and it was, whew, it was terrible special effects and also haunting at the same time. So I'm glad the Chosen did not do that. But instead, what they did is, as John's being leaned over, he looks out the window, and there's a lamb out there. You can barely see it in this picture, but there's a lamb there in the middle of that field. And he just says, "Thank you." And I thought, the first time I saw it, I thought I knew what he meant. And then later, as I contemplated it more, I think he's saying, thank you for this mission. Thank you for allowing me to be the one that made the path straight and proclaimed that who was coming behind him was the suffering servant and the Messiah. And so I think thank you there is very appropriate instead of trying to squirm and trying to plead for your life. He was done with what he'd been sent to do, and he did it well. So we move on to the feeding of the 5,000. This is a story that everybody, or a lot of people, are familiar with. I probably shouldn't say everybody, but almost everybody who claims to be Christian is familiar with this story. Mark 6:30 through 44 is where it's found in Mark, and it tells us there were 5,000 hungry people. But as you and I discussed, really that's 5,000 men, not including wives and children. So we've got a very large number of people here. And Jesus has been preaching and teaching, and they're starving because they haven't stopped. There's not been a break to go to the concession stand or to have lunch. And the only person that seemed like he was packed for the day, that thought that this thing might go longer than everybody else apparently, was a young boy who brought his lunch. And he had 5 loaves and 2 fish with him. That Jesus prays to the Father and then tells the apostles to distribute this food. And they're probably thinking, how do we distribute 5 loaves and 2 fish among 5,000 plus people? But it miraculously just keeps coming. It's an endless supply of food. And so what all are we supposed to notice in this?
Well, there's actually a lot of things we can talk about. First of all, as the text says, it cost a fortune to feed these people.
Mm-hmm.
The scene here doesn't really tell us exactly where it is. On the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, you have all the way from Magdala over to Bethesda and even further, but you have several villages there. Capernaum, Chorazin is just a little off of the lake there, and it's very hard. But somebody came along and said, "We think we know the spot." And so just to the southwest of Capernaum, there's a place called Tabgha, and there is the church of the feeding of the 5,000, or the church of the 2 fish and 5 loaves there. So we don't exactly know where it was, but the scene in the background makes it pretty clear that it's on one of those hilly areas just in that area in the northern part of the Sea of Galilee.
As we notice in the narrative, Jesus goes up the mountain to pray, so it's got to be hilly. Not only just from what we know of the geography, but also from the narrative itself, telling us at the end after the feeding was completed. But there's so many things here that just every time I go through this story, I see something that I didn't see previously. I love how he tells the apostles in their shock. You mentioned how expensive it would be to feed these people, and this is the Wilson paraphrase, but their response is basically like, "Well, let's send them away and let them go get some food." And Jesus says to them, "No, you feed them." And that freaks them out. Well, what are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to get enough food or enough money? I can just see them so confused. On, well, let's pool all of our resources together. We can't even buy enough food for, for 1,000 people, much less for 5,000 plus. But Jesus meant co-work with him to feed the people. And then I think it gets even deeper in meaning because they had more than enough to feed all the people who were present, and they still had 12 baskets remaining. And that can't just be coincidence. You and I don't believe in coincidences anyway, but that 12, I think, there is significant. There's 12 apostles. They're set up as the new kingdom, new creation, new Israel, 12, like the 12 tribes were in the Old Testament. Also interesting is that the baskets that remain that are 12 are full. So everyone who's been fed, and we would assume, right, Dr. Cloud, that not everybody in that 5,000 plus people were Jewish. So they're feeding whoever came to listen to Jesus, which could be Gentiles and Jews, obviously. And yet, God's original chosen people aren't forgotten because there's still extra left over for them. And I think there's a lot of meaning in all of that.
Yeah, this is a miracle that's not is only recorded by the people that knew about it. The apostles knew, and Peter remembers this scene vividly. And people didn't walk away saying it was a miracle because it was kind of like the changing the water to wine. Only a handful of people knew what had happened there, and here it's the same thing. They really don't know what is taking place. But you mentioned this being an area of Gentiles there too. Yeah, this was Galilee. Sometimes was known as, even in Scripture, the Galilee of the Gentiles. And a lot of the capital cities are close by, filled with people that are not Jewish. So you're right about that. There were peoples of all kind here in Galilee.
And this is what we normally see. I don't know why it's in a dish. I'm sure they didn't have brown paper bags like we have for our lunches, but I'm assuming that he would have had a knapsack or something, or some sort of bag that he was carrying it in. But I think we overlook that too. I think we overlook the childlike love and faith that, well, I'll share my lunch. I mean that's interesting. Most adults would probably have not even uttered that sentence of what they had because they would just think that it was ridiculous notion that it could be of any real help. But he didn't seem to think that way. And Jesus obviously didn't think that way. But there's another interesting thing I wanted to do. I'm trying to bring it up on this other screen over here because I couldn't fit it all on the slide. There's an interesting comparison that one scholar's put together between Psalm 23 and Mark 6. And I just have two of the verses on the screen for you. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, verse 1 of Psalm 23. And then look at what happens in Mark 6. Jesus says they're sheep without a shepherd. So Jesus shepherds them, and they all eat and were satisfied. So they had no want, they had no need. And then verse 2 of Psalm 23 says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. And it says that when he got ready to do this, he put them into groups and had them sit down on the green grass. And so I hope you're getting some chills with this as we go through this. Psalm 23:3 says he restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And in Mark 6:31 through 41, Jesus talks about getting some rest, and Jesus taught them, and Jesus gave public thanks to God. And then verse 4 of Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. And 6:27 of Mark, disciples are in the shadow of John's death. He's just been beheaded. We've just talked about the death of John the Baptist. And the disciples are afraid of the storm that we're getting ready to talk about. And Jesus tells them not to be afraid, for he's with them. And so it's just amazing how I've never really seen anybody do that. And it goes on, and it'll get a little bit of ahead of where we are right now. So we'll just encourage you to look at it. Look at Psalm 23 and compare it with Mark chapter 6 and see if you don't see some of the echoes there from the psalm. in the narrative that's going on and how Jesus is displaying that he's God. This is Dallas Jenkins' interesting little phrase. I think I got it. If it's not exactly right, it's really close. He's the creator of The Chosen, and he uses the 5 and 2. You've probably seen me wear it some, the 5 and 2 logo that is talking about feeding the 5,000. But he does it for this. It was something that struck him and his wife, and one of their low points of trying to keep energy up for this long 7-year long project. He said it is not our job to feed the 5,000. We just bring our 2 fish and 5 loaves. Jesus does the rest. And I think that's, if we take anything away from the feeding of the 5,000, that's what it should be, is that little boy gave up what he had and gave it to Jesus, and Jesus used it. And that's what fed the 5,000. Nobody without Jesus was going to feed the 5,000. But whatever we bring to Jesus, he can use. And then when he multiplies it like he did, like he told them, you feed them, then thanks to Jesus, they were able to feed the 5,000. So it's an interesting approach to missional work and how we are in the world, I think. And I really like that Dallas coined that saying. So then we move to Mark 6:45 through 48, walking on the water. And this one kind of surprised us a little bit too, right? The immediately word shows up again. Jesus tells his disciples to get in the boat. Now, this is immediately on the heels of feeding the 5,000. This area that we were just talking about, he tells them to go across to the other side of the lake, go to Bethsaida, while he disperses the crowd. And that crowd is the 5,000 plus people. And then after saying goodbye to them, he goes to the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and Jesus was all alone on the land, and he saw them straining at the oars because the wind was against them. I have been told by some people that what we need to probably envision here is paddling and paddling and paddling like crazy to make no forward progress. The amount of force that's being put through the oars in the water to move the boat, to propel the boat, is matched by the wind, and so you've got to continue this strenuous work to really get nowhere, and that's why they're in the middle of the sea. And then as the night was ending, he came to them walking on the sea, for he wanted to pass by them. And Dr. Cloud, that's our first interesting tidbit in Mark's account that's not over in Matthew's or John's. What does that mean? He wanted to pass by them.
Well, we discussed it earlier today, and I didn't think about it till just now, but that can be translated, he had wanted to pass by. That is, his original intention was to pass by, let them make their way, he'd make his way and meet them on the other side. You and I looked at several different options of that, so we can't be sure, but for some reason, this is what Peter remembers. Peter remembers that part of the story that maybe later they had a discussion about it, or he found out then. But then Jesus decided, apparently, that they needed his help. And this was going to be a good time to reveal something that we'll tell you in just a minute.
Yeah, well, I really like how you did that. I agree with you. There's some other theories out there we don't have time, unfortunately, to cover right now. But yeah, they were going to go across the lake in the boat, and he was going to go across the lake in his own way. And if who knows, if they hadn't been inhibited by the wind and the waves, maybe they would have arrived over there before he did. But what's really interesting is you bringing up the fact this is what Peter remembers, and what we do notice here that's absent is Peter doesn't ask to get out of the boat in Mark's account, and Peter doesn't walk on the water in Mark's account, and Peter doesn't sink in Mark's account. And that's kind of odd, since it's Peter who's relaying this information to Mark.
Yeah, Peter, as we've tried to point out many times through Mark, and how much Mark edited out, we don't know, but he's one that penned it. And for some reason, Mark has these quick snapshots of what's going on, and then he's going to immediately go someplace else to the next scene. So even though we can't be dogmatic about it, it's again, it could be the influence of Peter there, that Peter really wasn't too thrilled about his own lack of faith here.
Could be. Instead of us going down all of those paths, which again we're approaching the end here, let's look at what is very fascinating to me. The way this ends here on the screen in verse 52 specifically, it says, "They were completely astonished because they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." So there's a reference back. They did not understand about the loaves is a reference back to the fact that we've just come from feeding the 5,000. That's very different than the way it ends in Matthew. Everything else here is pretty much the same. Have courage, it is I. They thought they saw a ghost. They cried out. Jesus says, never fear, do not be afraid. And then when he goes up into the boat with them, the wind ceases. That's all congruent. The ending about not understanding the loaves is not in Matthew. The account there has a different takeaway, I think, and that's what we want to look at here as we end this morning. Here's a picture of what it might have looked like. I still contend that with these raging seas and probably thunder and lightning and wind and everything that's going on, no one's voice would be recognizable. If I was yelling over the waves to you, Dr. Cloud, you probably wouldn't say, "Oh, I know that voice. That's Stan." No, that's some probably male or person. Maybe you can't even tell if it's male or female in trouble or yelling or trying to change their projection or their voice over everything else that's going on. So I think we have to take a step back and say, wait a second, Jesus is not a ghost. Why would they think he was a ghost? Because, well, we just talked about last week the pigs running over the cliff and going into the Sea of Galilee, right? And a lot of people thought that if evil spirits went into the water, they couldn't escape the water because they couldn't get into anything in the water other than fish, and fish don't come out of the water. So that's where they would be. And so a lot of people contend that phrase was that they thought that they were witnessing something that had come up from the water, and therefore it would be something to be scared of. The water itself is an element of chaos and death in the Hebrew Bible. You can't walk on water. Water is obviously something that is chaotic, and we can't breathe water, so it's also an element of death. Jesus has power over both of those things in what they're seeing. But probably the biggest thing for me is the phrase, it is I, ego eimi in Greek, which the Septuagint in Exodus 3:14 says the exact same thing, ego eimi, at the burning bush when Moses asks, "Who will I say that you are? What is your name?" And God says, "I am that I am." And when we look at it that way, we're understanding that Jesus was calling out, "I am." He wasn't saying, "It is I," or it is some nebulous phrase of, "Hey, it's me, don't worry." He was saying, "I am." They interpreted that. Then they probably had Psalm 107 come back in their heads. I won't read all this to you, but Psalm 107, 23 through 30 is a very interesting passage where God is the only being who can calm the winds and the waves that the sailors are experiencing. And it even says that they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and he delivered them from their troubles. And he calmed the storm, and the waves grew silent. And the sailors rejoiced because the waves grew quiet, and he, God, led them to the harbor they desired. Well, look at what happens at the end of Matthew for this Matthew's scene. Sorry, at the end of this scene in Matthew in verse 33 of chapter 14. Then those who were in the boat, when Jesus gets in the boat with them, worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So I think there's a lot going on here, even all the way back to him intending to pass them by. Some people have contrasted that or compared that with Moses and God passing by while he was in the cleft of the rock, or Elijah and God telling him, "Go outside and stand, and I will pass by." It's all imagery for Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the embodied Yahweh. He is I am. And they respond to that because they worship him. And this is the first time that we have a recording in Scripture that they worshiped Jesus, is when he got into the boat with them. So to me, that's very powerful and kind of changes this whole story. Now why Peter didn't get out of the boat in Mark's account, Like you said, Dr. Cloud, we could speculate, but we probably shouldn't.
Okay, I think again, the fact that they were blinded, their hearts were hardened, they were blinded. Putting all this together, eventually, of course, Peter and Mark are looking back at it. But you were there, they were there. Some of them were there at the wedding. Some were there at the feeding of 5,000. Some were there listening to his sermons and how people were angry at him. They were there when he walked across the sea on the water. And so all of this is taking time to settle in and for them to comprehend. But they're looking back now on the situation and kind of telling where they were. And Peter said, we still were blind. And then this kind of a breakthrough. So they began to say, well, maybe this is God. And they worship him.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for being with us, and we pray blessings over you, and may the peace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ be with you, and may you have a blessed week. We'll see you next week.